Daniel Rourke was the quiet man 2 doors down, the kind neighbors barely noticed, until his fixation on Lena Moore grew into an unrelenting obsession that would end in a night of blood and silence. In the small town of Brookhaven, life moved at a gentle pace. The streets were lined with old maple trees that swayed in the wind, casting patterned shadows on the pavement below. It was the sort of place where neighbors waved to each other, and little ever changed from one year to the next. On the day Lena Moore arrived, the calm rhythm of the neighborhood seemed undisturbed, yet for one man, the sight of her stepping out of a moving truck would become the moment that altered everything. Daniel Rourke had lived 2 doors down for over a decade, leading a life that barely touched anyone else's. He worked quietly from home, avoided large gatherings, and kept his conversations to a polite minimum. To most, he was the quiet man with tired eyes who seemed harmless, maybe even forgettable. But as he watched Lena carry the first box through her new front door, something shifted inside him. First, it was no more than a curious glance, the natural attention people give to a newcomer. She was young, with a warm presence that seemed to belong more to a bustling city than a sleepy town. Her laughter floated lightly in the air as she greeted the movers, her voice carrying just enough for Daniel to hear through his open window. He found himself leaning forward slightly, straining to catch every word without realizing it. She was a stranger, yet already felt like a detail his life had been waiting for. He didn't know her name then, but it didn't matter. Her image had already been set into his mind with the clarity of a photograph. Over the following days, he noticed her more often. She took early morning walks, always heading down the same quiet lane. She watered her garden just after sunset, standing barefoot on the grass. Every detail was absorbed by Daniel with an intensity that startled even him. There was something magnetic in the way she moved through the world, unaware of the attention she drew. He told himself it was harmless curiosity, the kind anyone might have about a new neighbor. Yet the more he saw, the less it felt like casual interest and the more it resembled a need, one that settled deep in his chest and refused to fade. Daniel's own life began to rearrange itself around hers without him noticing. He adjusted his coffee breaks so he could glance out the window when she returned from her walk. He started leaving his trash out a little later in the morning, timed perfectly so he might catch her at the curb. These were small choices, easy to justify to himself. But in reality, they were the first steps down a path that would narrow with every passing week. When she smiled politely at him in passing, he replayed the moment in his head over and over, convinced it meant more than it did. By the second week, Daniel had memorized her routines with quiet precision. He knew what time her kitchen light flicked on in the morning, what evening she left the house in her small blue car, and when she returned. Her life began to feel like a pattern laid out for him to read, as if he alone had been allowed to understand it. He felt a strange comfort in the knowledge, even though it was built on nothing more than his own silent watching. Lena had become the center of his thoughts, the anchor point for his days, and everything else seemed to fade into the background. What began as a single glance had grown roots, and beneath the calm surface of Brookhaven, something dangerous had already begun to take hold. Weeks passed, and Daniel's quiet fixation deepened into something far more consuming. His days no longer felt complete unless he had seen Lena, even if only from a distance. At first, he told himself it was harmless, that everyone noticed their neighbors now and then. But harmless things don't rearrange a person's life in secret. Without realizing it, his schedule bent entirely around hers. If she took her morning walk at 7, he found himself outside at 6:55, pretending to water his plants or adjust his mailbox. If she came home from work after dark, he sat in his dimly lit living room, waiting for the moment her headlights curved into the driveway. He became an expert at reading the smallest signs of her day. If her curtains stayed closed in the morning, she was sleeping in. If her car was missing before dawn, she had an early shift or a weekend trip. He began keeping these details in his mind as though they were important records, pieces of a story. Only he was allowed to follow. It gave him a strange, private sense of importance, as if he understood her in a way no one else could. In truth, he didn't know her at all, but in Daniel's mind, that distance didn't matter. Soon, watching wasn't enough. He began finding ways to collect pieces of her life, though he never thought of it in those terms. One day, when she left her trash out, a crumpled coffee cup with lipstick on the rim caught his eye. He told himself it was nothing, just curiosity, but he placed it in a showbox in his closet. A week later, he spotted a grocery receipt peeking from the top of her recycling bin. He slipped it into his pocket, studying the list later as though it revealed something intimate about her. These small objects became like anchors, proof that she existed not only in the world, but in his possession. When Lena was in her yard, he always found a reason to be outside. If she was watering plants, he was trimming his hedges. If she was talking on the phone, he lingered nearby, pretending to check the air in his car's tires. Every smile she gave him fed the belief that there was a hidden connection between them. He ignored the fact that her expression was the same polite courtesy she offered to everyone in the neighborhood. In Daniel's mind, each glance was a confirmation, each passing moment an unspoken message. The more he learned about her patterns, the more a quiet dread began to grow inside him. It wasn't fear for her safety, it was fear of losing her to someone else. That thought began to haunt him. When a delivery man stayed too long at her door, Daniel found his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists. When she laughed too loudly at something a neighbor said, his chest ached with an ugly heat he couldn't name. He began to picture scenarios where someone else took her attention, where she no longer walked past his window, where her smile was meant for someone else. The images filled him with a restlessness that kept him awake at night, in the safety of his home, surrounded by the ordinary furniture of his quiet life. Daniel's thoughts had become anything but ordinary. Lena was no longer simply a neighbor. She was the thread that held his days together, and the idea of that thread being cut was unbearable. What had started as a quiet curiosity had hardened into something that felt like ownership, though he never spoke the word, even in his mind. And somewhere deep inside, without wanting to name it, he knew that ownership was only the beginning of what he would demand from her. It happened on an evening that seemed unremarkable to anyone else, but for Daniel, it was the start of an irreversible shift. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the streets of Brookhaven washed in pale orange light. Daniel was sitting by his window, the familiar hum of his small desk fan filling the silence, when he saw Lena step out onto her porch. She was dressed casually, her hair tied back, and she looked at ease in the fading daylight. Then, a man appeared. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and he walked straight up to her with the kind of familiarity that made Daniel's stomach knot. They spoke for only a few minutes, the man leaning against the porch railing while Lena smiled and nodded. It wasn't what they said. Daniel couldn't hear a word. It was the way she looked at him, as though she trusted him completely. That trust was not his to give. The moment burned into Daniel's mind, and something inside him shifted from unease to something sharper. The image of her smiling at another man replayed in his head long after the stranger left. In that replay, her warmth felt like betrayal, even though she owed him nothing. The logic didn't matter. What mattered was that his place in her life, however imagined, was suddenly threatened. That threat began to grow in his thoughts, shaping everything that followed. From that night forward, Daniel's behavior changed. He no longer cared if anyone saw him lingering near her property. He walked past her house repeatedly, sometimes crossing the street just to glance through the side windows. If her blinds were open, even a crack, he would pause to see inside. The barrier between watching from a distance and being part of her private world had thinned, and he felt less and less reason to respect it. He began to test the limits, small, calculated risks at first. One afternoon, when she left in her car, he walked up to her porch and pressed his hand against the front door, feeling the faint vibration of the refrigerator humming inside. Another time, he slipped into her backyard under the pretense of retrieving a ball that had rolled into her garden. He stood there longer than necessary, scanning every detail, the arrangement of the chairs, the scent of flowers, the faint sound of her wind chimes. Each visit fed a growing need that no longer found satisfaction in distant observation. The night he crossed the threshold for the first time was quiet, moonlight spilling across the neighborhood like pale water. She was out, and he knew it. He had watched her drive away earlier, seen her headlights vanish down the main road. The lock on the side door was old, the kind that gave way with a little pressure. Inside, the air was different, warmer, filled with traces of her life, perfume, laundry detergent, something sweet baking in the kitchen earlier that day. He moved carefully, touching nothing, but memorizing everything. Her shoes lined neatly by the door, a sweater draped over the couch, a book left open on the coffee table. Each object felt like proof that he was now part of her space, not just a shadow beyond the walls. When he left, he locked the door behind him, his heart pounding with a strange mix of triumph and calm. The thrill wasn't in stealing or damaging anything. It was in knowing he had been inside, unseen, uninvited, yet somehow convinced it was his right. The act rewired something in his mind. Watching her from a window no longer felt enough. He had tasted proximity, and it had awakened a hunger that would not fade. What had once been quiet obsession had transformed into something more dangerous, the certainty that sooner or later she would belong to him entirely, no matter the cost. The storm rolled in without warning, wind bending the trees until their branches scraped against rooftops. Rain hammered the streets of Brookhaven, turning the quiet neighborhood into a blur of movement and sound. Lena's house sat dark except for a single light in the living room, its glow muted behind drawn curtains. Daniel had been watching for hours, sitting in the driver's seat of his car parked at the far end of the block. The longer he sat there, the more the storm seemed to mirror what was churning inside him, restless, volatile, inevitable. He knew she was out, and he knew she would return soon. Every minute of waiting tightened the coil in his chest. This night would be different. By the time Lena's car appeared, the rain had eased into a steady curtain, the storm's fury shifting to a quieter menace. She pulled into her driveway, her headlights cutting briefly across the slick pavement before vanishing as she turned off the engine. Daniel was already moving. He had parked his car in a side alley and approached through the backyard, his shoes sinking into wet grass. The side door, the one he had tested before, opened as easily as it had the first time. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of candles, a sweetness that made the space feel more intimate. He stood in the hallway, the sound of the rain muffled to a faint patter. She entered moments later, the front door clicking shut behind her. Daniel's breathing slowed, his body frozen in the shadow between the kitchen and the living room. She moved around the space with the ease of someone who felt safe, dropping her bag on the counter, slipping off her shoes, humming softly under her breath. That sense of safety stirred something deep in him, not admiration but the belief that he was the only one who truly understood her, the only one who could keep her from everything else that threatened to take her away. When she finally noticed the shift in the air, it was too late. Daniel stepped forward, his presence filling the space between them. The moment stretched thin, no word spoken, no sound but the faint ticking of a clock and the rain sliding down the windows. Her eyes widened in recognition, confusion flashing. Into fear. That fear did not slow him, it hardened his resolve. To him, this was not an intrusion but the completion of something long overdue. The struggle was brief and silent. The storm outside swallowed what little noise there was, the wind masking every sharp intake of breath, every scuffle against the floor. In Daniel's mind, it was not an act of violence but of permanence, the final step in binding her to him, in a way that no one could undo. When it was over, she lay still, the room heavy with the absence of movement. He stood over her, the weight of what he had done settling not as regret, but as an eerie calm rain streaked the glass, distorting the world outside into shifting patterns of light and shadow. He stayed there for a long time, watching her as if memorizing every detail for the last time. Yet the satisfaction he had expected never arrived. Instead, there was a hollow ache, as though he had taken what he wanted only to find it empty in his hands. The possession he had craved had left him with nothing but silence, a silence that seemed louder than the storm. When he finally left, locking the door behind him, Brookhaven looked unchanged from the outside. But in one quiet house, the balance had shifted forever, And the night had claimed more than just the rain. Morning came to Brookhaven with the same soft light it always carried, but the calm was fragile, ready to splinter. Lena's absence was noticed almost immediately. She was the kind of neighbor who was part of the town's quiet rhythm. Her morning walk, her warm greetings, the small exchanges that stitched her into the community's daily life. When she didn't appear that day, it was enough to stir unease. By the afternoon, her car still sat in the driveway, untouched, and calls to her phone went unanswered. Concern grew into alarm, and soon a knock came at her door from a worried neighbor. No one answered. The police were called before the sun had set. Officers arrived in pairs, their radios crackling softly in the still air. They entered the house and found it neat, almost too neat. A handbag sat open on the kitchen counter, keys inside. A cup of tea had been made and left untouched, the liquid now cold. It was in the living room that they found her. The scene was quiet, but heavy with something unspoken, as though the walls themselves knew what had happened. The first responders moved methodically, securing the space, taking photographs, gathering details. Outside, word spread quickly. Curtains twitched in windows, voices dropped to whispers. Brookhaven's safety had been broken, and everyone felt the fracture. Detectives began piecing together the final hours of Lena's life. There were no signs of a forced entry at the front of the house, but the side door showed faint scratches around the lock, marks that would have gone unnoticed to anyone not looking for them. It suggested someone had been inside before. The timeline was narrow, and they needed answers fast. They canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to anyone who might have seen something. Most had noticed nothing unusual, but one elderly resident mentioned a car parked at the far end of the block for several hours during the storm. She hadn't recognized it. Surveillance footage from a corner store provided the first real break. In the grainy black and white recording, a man's figure appeared briefly, walking past with his hood pulled low. The resolution was poor, but his posture, his gait, and the faint reflection of his face in a window were enough to spark recognition for those who knew Daniel Rourke. His name was not a common one in police reports, but when detectives visited his home, they were met with an unsettling sight. Inside, the air was stale, the blinds drawn tight. In a closet, hidden behind old coats, was a showbox filled with small, ordinary items: coffee cups, grocery receipts, a torn piece of ribbon. To anyone else, they were meaningless, but to investigators, they were unmistakably personal belongings of Lena's. Stacked in neat piles on a desk were photographs, many taken without her knowledge. In one corner sat a notebook filled with detailed notes, times, dates, observations, each entry a record of her life from his perspective. The level of obsession was clear, and so was the connection to the night of the storm. Daniel was arrested without incident, his expression calm, as if none of it surprised him. In interviews, he spoke of Lena as though she had been bound to him in some unspoken agreement, describing their connection with a conviction that ignored reality. His version of events blurred the line between truth and delusion, but the evidence was unshakable. The trial drew quiet but intense attention from the community, each day revealing another detail of how closely he had watched her life. When the verdict came, it was swift, guilty on all counts. Daniel Rourke was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He showed no visible reaction as the decision was read. For Brookhaven, the case became a lasting scar, a reminder that danger did not always arrive as a stranger in the night. Sometimes, it lived 2 doors down, blending into the quiet until the moment when obsession demanded blood.